Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, my dear brothers, sisters, friends, and the foes out there, and welcome to another episode of the Blood Brothers podcast with your host, Dilly Hussain. Before I introduce today's guest, I want to remind all the avid podcast listeners that you can find this episode on all 3 seasons on all the major audio platforms. If you're tuning in via YouTube, don't be cheeky. Remember to click subscribe to the 5 Pillars YouTube channel. Today's guest is somewhat of a superstar and a legend. He actually requires no real introduction, but I'm going to give him one anyway. He is an erudite academic, writer, activist, someone with a very interesting story and a legal case to talk to us about. And that's none other than the legendary Dr. David Miller. David, welcome.
Hello.
How are you?
Salam.
Welcome.
I'm well.
You outdressed me. I wore jeans for you and you rocked up in a blazer and a tie.
It's always going to be the way.
I'm sorry. How's things?
Fine. Things are, splendid, notwithstanding the awful state of the world.
There's lots for us to talk about because there's the whole personal case, the legal case that's ongoing. The background to that. Your recent trip to Turkey. Lots for us to cover. Because a lot of today's podcast is going to be around Zionism.
Yeah.
Its militaristic form in the occupied lands and its nefarious ideological tentacles of influence here and across Western governments. I want to just get your thoughts on the following organizations and what you know of them. Board of Deputies.
You're going to take them one at a time?
Yeah. I want you to tell me about the Board of Deputies.
So the Board of Deputies, of course, is an organisation with pretensions to having a democratic structure, which is elected from synagogues, from mainstream synagogues mainly, and which used to be anti-Zionist. In the 1940s, the Zionists took it over, and since then it's been pro-Zionist in favour of the establishment of a Jewish state in Palestine. And of course, today it's a fairly rabid pro-Zionist organisation. It reports in its annual reports and accounts, which you can view online, that it works closely with the Israeli Prime Minister's office, with the IDF spokesman's office, and with a whole list of other Zionist organisations. It claims to be just there to represent Jews, but of course is there to promote Israel, and that's its function. But the other thing I'd say about it, though, thinking about this in terms of what the Zionist movement is that this is an organisation which has some 200 odd members, okay? And there are other Zionist organisations which have lots of members, the Jewish Leadership Council or the Zionist Federation. And if you put all those organisations together, you have hundreds of Zionist organisations in the UK, which I think many people don't appreciate.
Community Security Trust.
The Community Security Trust is, of course, an organisation which first complained about me many years ago, but in terms of the story of me being sacked, they were the ones who initiated the complaint back in 2019, which in 2021 saw me sacked. We'll come back to that. It's an organisation which was set up by a guy called Gerald Ronson, who runs a company called Rontech. They have 265 SO and BP service stations up and down the country. I don't see that on the BDS list, and it should be. And so he's a guy who comes from a kind of slightly dodgy background. In the 1960s, he was the money man behind this supposed anti-fascist group, which was in reality a revisionist Zionist organisation, which went on to form various other organisations like Searchlight, for example, and then the CST was formed in 1994. It says it's there to protect Jews from anti-Semitism, right? That's what it says it does. Of course, what it does is run point for the Israeli government and deliberately confuses people about the difference between anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism in direct alliance with the Zionist entity itself.
The Jewish Chronicle.
The Jewish Chronicle is the main Zionist newspaper in the country. There are others, but it's the main one. And it's been like that for a long time. I've been writing something on this. I haven't published it yet. But if you go back into the history, it was quite Zionist, and it became more kind of liberal socialist Zionist, well, Labour Zionist, I suppose is the term. But more recently, it's been taken over by this kind of far-right phalanx of people who saved it from going bust. And it's run by this guy called Robbie Gibb, who is the sole director of the company. There's a number of other financiers who bought it out from its previous owners. And Gibb is someone who has history with the CIA. He was actually involved in the CIA operation behind the Iron Curtain in the Soviet Union back in the day, and he's been a BBC governor, and he's been in Whitehall and worked for the Tories and that kind of thing. But it's an organisation which is set up to libel the pro-Palestine movement, anyone on the left who would criticise Israel. And of course, it's got the largest number of libel cases it's lost, I think, of any member of the of IPSO, the Independent Press Monitoring Organisation. So it's there to attack anyone, Muslim, non-Muslim, who is interested in criticising Israel.
A new organisation that's emerged, or at least they've come onto the radar recently, and they're very active on Twitter. It's called Campaign Against Antisemitism. Yeah,
this was set up just before Corbyn was elected as leader of the Labour Party, and it was effectively set up by Israel. It was funded in the early days by the Jewish National Fund, which is a formal part of the Zionist movement in the UK, and its purpose is to defame pro-Palestine campaigners and to have them sacked from their jobs, and it's done that very effectively. There are campaigns against its registration at the Charity Commission, which have so far been unsuccessful. But it's a very unusual organisation in the sense that I'm not aware of any other organisations which have a dispensation at Companies House not to name the directors of the organisation. And so that's a pretty incredible level of secrecy. But as a result of our research, we found out that it's been essentially funded to a large degree by the Jewish National Fund.
Not naming a director on Companies House, surely that would have happened through a special request of some sort.
That's right, yeah.
Bonkers.
Well, and it's the same with the Charity Commission. So the CST it has a dispensation not to name its trustees at the Charity Commission, but it doesn't have that dispensation at Companies House, so that it's the CST support trustee is the company, and you can find out its directors from there. But the CAA does have that dispensation, and of course it means that you can't hold them to account, and you can't also find out the extent to which they have conflicts of interest or that they're funding each other. And so, for example, one of the directors we know is a guy called Daniel Allington, who is an academic and who also poses as being an independent academic commissioned by the CAA to do dodgy research saying that everyone's anti-Semitic. Now that's preposterous, and if anyone knew that, well, some of them do now, then the whole basis of the organisation falls apart.
Last organisation, this is one perhaps a bit less known, but somewhat integrated, or at least attempts to integrate itself within the Muslim community. Nisha Nisam.
Nisa Nishim, of course, is named after the Hebrew and the Arabic words for women. And of course, it presents itself as being for Jewish and Muslim women, and it's about people getting together and understanding each other's points of view.
Interfaith and that kind of stuff.
Interfaith, yeah. But in reality, of course, it's a Zionist operation to try and infiltrate the Muslim community and to draw the sting of the Muslim community, in particular as a result of the anti-war movement of the 2000s, where the Zionists and indeed the British government were shocked and rocked actually by the alliance between the left and the Muslims from 2003 onwards, and have devoted huge revenues and efforts to try and divide them and draw the sting. Nisa Nishim is simply one of those organisations which claims things about its origins which are simply untrue. It was birthed by the Board of Deputies, so you can tell it's a Zionist organisation.
Let's start with your case. 2021. You were a professor at the University of Bristol. You made some comments with regards to Zionism, anti-Semitism. What were the exact comments in question that led to the initial firing?
Well, I mean, this is a 3-year story. So I started at Bristol.
Give us some snapshots.
I started at Bristol in September 2018. I won't take too long. And in February 2019, I gave a lecture on Islamophobia, where for, 3-4 minutes, and you can tell exactly how long it was because the Jewish News leaked a recording of me talking about the Zionist movement, where I talk about the role of the Zionist movement in promoting and spreading Islamophobia. Now, this is research which we had carried out, especially starting off with the Henry Jackson Society, well-known Islamophobic think tank, and we'd looked at the top 13 funders that we could find evidence of, and 12 of the 13 turned out to be Zionist foundations run by Zionist families, rich Zionist business people. And so we said, look, there's a specific role in pushing Islamophobic ideas on the public and on government for the Zionists, and we need to talk about this. Now, at the time, I hadn't really any idea of what Zionism was or what the movement was. And it was only because we had this empirical finding of these people pushing Islamophobia that we started to investigate it.
You're saying up until 2018, 19, you didn't understand the extent?
No, we did the research in 2009, 10, 11. So
sorry.
And so as a result of that, I started investigating Zionism, and that's what got me into bother. And so in February 2019, I do this lecture, and a couple of students, apparently anonymously, approached the Community Security Trust, who complained to the university, which rejected the complaint because they're not a student. So the CST immediately got onto the Union of Jewish Students in London, the umbrella body, and they then recruited the president of the Bristol Jewish Society, which of course is a formal member of the UJS, and as a result of that is a formal member of the Zionist movement because they're affiliated.
Very coordinated.
They're coordinated, yeah. And so they submitted this complaint. The complaint was only accepted from the president of the Bristol Jewish Society because she was a student. Not my student, never been to any of my lectures, and she admitted in the investigation she'd never even spoken to anyone who'd been to my lectures, right? So she had no idea. But so she submitted this complaint. They rejected it. The internal system rejected it and said there was no case to answer, that I wasn't anti-Semitic. And then she complained about that, and she was trying to appeal that. And the university, but she said, the problem was that they hadn't considered her complaint under the IHRA, because Bristol at that point didn't have the IHRA. So the university went back to her and said, well, we're thinking about bringing it in. So how about if you pause your complaint until we decide whether to change the rules or not? And she said, oh, yes, thank you very much. And then they lobbied for that. They changed the rules in December 2000.
Adopt the IHRA definition.
Yeah. And then in January 2020, they appointed a QC, now a KC, to investigate the complaint under the new rules, of course, which is completely a matter of not of natural justice. And this QC investigated the issue. Took about a year for that to happen. In December that year, the report was issued. Well, sorry, the report wasn't issued. The report was finished, which concluded that there wasn't a single thing I'd ever said. I mean, and they looked at lots of stuff that was in any way anti-Semitic. So there was no case to answer. So I was like, well, great. And the university refused to publish this, and I was still getting attacked.
Why did they refuse to publish it?
I mean, they refused to publish it, I think, because they would have been attacked more by the Zionists.
To try keeping it quiet.
I think that's they were absolutely trying to keep it quiet. I don't know what was in their mind. I mean, it's very difficult to work out what was in their mind. Anyhow, so I was cleared of all charges. I was given a letter saying, there's no case to answer. We've got nothing to suggest. You don't have to moderate anything you say. There's no requirements. 6 weeks later, I go on this Labour Against the Witch Hunt political meeting Saturday afternoon, out of work, talk about the Zionist attack on higher education. And in the course of those comments, of course, I say, well, as some of you will know, I've been attacked and complained about, that's the words I used, by the president of the Union of Jewish Students and the president of the Bristol Jewish Society, and et cetera, et cetera. I didn't even say that the complaint was manifestly hopeless, which is what the QC had said about it. And as a result of that, saying that simple statement, there was a massive outcry, and people called for me to be sacked. Zionist professors in my university wrote to the university demanding I be sacked. Over 100 members of the House of Lords and House of Commons wrote to the university demanding I be sacked. Something like 25 or 30 different Zionist organisations wrote to the university, etc., etc. Some funding agencies, some Zionist foundations which gave money to the university threatened to pull the money if they didn't sack me, etc. So there was a huge campaign against me. There was no complaint against me. No one made a formal complaint. Not a single student made a complaint.
Just pressure to sack you.
Just pressure to sack me. So the university unilaterally had another investigation. But this time, they only gave the issue about anti-Semitism to the QC, who again concluded that I hadn't said a single thing which was anti-Semitic, etc. But they also had a retired professor investigate me who concluded that I had upset some students, and that probably wasn't a good thing. And then as a result of that, they sacked me. And that was in October 2021.
What's the legal case right now?
So I took an appeal with the university. They rejected it, and then I lodged an employment tribunal case in 2022 sometime, and it came to court on the 16th of October last year. So 9 days after the launch of Al-Aqsa Flood. Right? And that was really very, very interesting in terms of what happened. And so we had several days in court. I was in the witness box for 2.5 days. The university had 4 witnesses. The the university's witnesses essentially soiled themselves in court and more or less, admitted that I had been wrongfully dismissed because they didn't do a proper investigation. They didn't properly evaluate whether they could have given me any other measures apart from sacking. And they also admitted that although they had said I was sacked for upsetting students, not because I was anti-Zionist, they also both admitted, the investigator and the person who sacked me, that effectively that the reason I was sacked was because I had anti-Zionist views. If I'd been a Zionist and I'd said the same things about the students,
you wouldn't have got sacked.
I wouldn't have been sacked. They admitted this in court. And so we're now at the stage of waiting for the judgment. So the university's witnesses made a very, very bad job of what was happening, as did the council and the legal team for the university. We're waiting now for the judge and the panel. There are two other lay people on the panel, one a trade union rep and one a boss's rep. And we're waiting for that judgment. It probably will come at the beginning of February, I would think.
It's a huge milestone case.
Well, it's a milestone.
Because it will set a precedent either way.
It's a milestone not in the sense of whether I was wrongfully dismissed, right? It's a milestone in terms of the question of my anti-Zionist beliefs, because that's a key second element of the case. I'm saying that I was sacked because I was an anti-Zionist and because I manifested the beliefs of being an anti-Zionist, which is contrary to the Equality Act of 2010, where beliefs are protected. And beliefs are protected so long as they were, this is the technical language, worthy of respect in a democratic society. And for your views to be not worthy of respect in a democratic society, the test is, are they akin to Nazism? So the university's case in the end was that my views were akin to Nazism. And that was a terrible mistake for the university because they couldn't establish any such thing. It was manifestly ridiculous. And so we're at the position where it's a test case because the court will have to declare whether anti-Zionist views of the sort which I advanced are protected under law, which would mean it would be illegal to sack people for being anti-Zionist. And that would be a precedent for everybody else.
Let's look at the implications for many what it exposed. The whole anti-Semitism, anti-Zionism, IHRA, why is there such an intentional muddling and synonymity to both from the Zionists? Why is it that they weaponize anti-Semitism for any criticism against the occupying Zionist entity? Why has that become the case? Why is it the same thing? And why is that enshrined in IHRA? Who put IHRA together, by the way, David? Who put that together?
I can tell you.
Who put that together? Do tell.
Well, the reason why they do it is because it's difficult to justify genocide. And when I say it's difficult to justify genocide, I don't mean since Al-Aqsa flood in October the 7th. I mean from the beginning. Zionism has always been a genocidal racist ideology which seeks to establish a Jewish state by specifically displacing or killing the indigenous inhabitants of Palestine. So in order to justify that in a world where there's a convention against genocide, where people think racism is a bad thing in general, they've got to find a way to undermine the idea that they're racists. And of course what they do is they say that anyone who criticises them is themselves racist against the Jews. So that they have to blur the distinction between anti-Semitism, racism against the Jews, and anti-Zionism, which of course is an anti-racist position. Now, where did it come from? Well, people often date it to the Israeli Foreign Minister Abba Eban, who made a famous statement on anti-Zionism is the new anti-Semitism. I mean, he was one of the earliest ones to use that phrase.
Well, they parrot that now regularly now. That is the line that they...
That's right. Yeah. But that was in 1972. There's a book in 1974 called The New Anti-Semitism, published in the US, published by an organisation called the Anti-Defamation League, which is, of course, the US equivalent of the CST, which exists to blur the distinction between anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism, and they started with the notion of new anti-Semitism in 74. But to be fair, they had been doing this for decades before that. And if you look at the now declassified FBI files on the ADL, you can see they were doing it against Arab Americans in the 1940s before the creation of Israel.
Wow.
Right?
Goes back then.
Back to then, right? But so that is a long tradition. But especially since 1967, and that's why Abba Eban does it in 72, they've tried to raise this thing. But the newest wave of the new anti-Semitism, it starts around 2000. And they create this thing called the Global Forum for Countering Anti-Semitism, started by this guy called Anatoly Sharansky, of course, Judaized and Hebrewized his name to Nathan Sharansky, became an ultra-settler supporter when he moved from the Soviet Union to Israel. And this Global Forum was dedicated to setting up the idea that there was a new anti-Semitism. So they as a result of that, they drew out this new definition, working definition of anti-Semitism, which they had adopted, or at least posted on the website of the European Union Monitoring Centre for against Xenophobia in 2002, right? But then there was some challenge against this. People say, well, this is ridiculous. This is blurring together two different things. And eventually the EUMC, when it became the Fundamental Rights Agency of the EU, dropped it. And this is around about, I think, 2010 or 11, sometime around that period. As a result, they didn't have anything. And so the Global Forum on Countering Anti-Semitism decides in around 2013 or 14 that they've got to find another place to lodge this definition. And the place that they find is the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, which of course adopts it in 2016, just the year after Jeremy Corbyn is elected as the leader of the Labour Party in the UK. So that's the weapon. The weapon is the IHRA, which blurs together Israel and racism against the Jews, which are, of course, entirely separate things. And they then have that weapon, which they can then bludgeon trade unions and academics and journalists and Muslims and anyone else who gets in the way and say that they're actually racist, when, of course, what's being said is that Israel is a racist settler state and should be constrained, some people say, or abolished as is a sensible position. So that's how they did it. I mean, they produced this weapon, and then, of course, in order to bludgeon people with it, they have to have organisations on the ground. They have to have troops on the ground. CAA, you discussed earlier, that's one of them. They created a huge number of new pro-Israel groups in around from 2014 onwards. In this country, something like 40 or 50 new pro-Israel groups, and the same in other countries too. It happened in France and Germany and the US, and it happened, of course, in the UK too. They create all these new organisations which then have the boots on the ground to be able to make complaints about people who have used the term Zio or compared Netanyahu to a Nazi, or all of these things that they say are anti-Semitic, which are, of course, are not.
But let's look at it in terms of from a legal point of view, right? The UK government's adopted IHRA. How many universities have adopted IHRA?
I forget the total, but I think it's something like 50 or 60.
Okay, so
not all of them, but
not all of them yet. Do you see more universities adopting this?
Well, look, we're reaching something of a crunch point. I mean, the UCL, I think, was the university which rejected it, which adopted it and then rejected it, and some have not adopted it, and we're going to reach a point where it's going to be rejected by a lot of organisations, because we're reaching, the point where the accusation of anti-Semitism has no power anymore. And
it's become a joke, hasn't it, David?
It's always been a joke, but it's increasingly being seen as a joke. I mean, its power came from the way in which people genuflected before it, or showed obeisance to it, or were intimidated by it. And there are fewer and fewer people being intimidated now, and more people saying, this is genocide, and it's not racist to say it.
Let's talk more about Zionism and how it funds and feeds and exacerbates and contributes heavily to the global Islamophobia industry. Now, as a Muslim, and as a Muslim outlet and a Muslim platform, I get that the Palestinian cause for liberation, the Palestinian struggle for freedom, it's one for people of justice, one for people of conscience. It transcends races, religions, all of that. I accept that. But for the Muslims, there is no other reason except for the guy in Indonesia, to the guy in Morocco, to the guy in Dagestan, to the guy in Tanzania, to care for the cause of Palestine, except that it has a religious significance to it. And you can see from the current onslaught in Gaza, the last 102-3 days, that a lot of these genocidal TikTok videos that have been coming out from IDF soldiers has specifically, overtly been referencing the Muslimness of the Palestinians.
Sure.
Right? How has Zionism or the Zionist movement contributed towards the global Islamophobia industry?
Well, I mean, as I said before, this is how we got into this, by saying, look, here's the Henry Jackson Society. It's pushing Islamophobic ideas. It's pushing these ideas about Muslim extremism and the way in which Muslims behave in such a way which is threatening to Western values or whatever. And that's Islamophobia. And when we discovered that they were being funded by Zionists, and so then you start to look at who the Zionists are, what they're doing, but also how far this goes back. This set of ideas about the reactionary or uncivilized nature of Muslims, or indeed, of course, of Arabs or Palestinians specifically. And it goes back quite far. And of course, I would make 2 points here. One is the notion of Islamic terrorism. Now, where does the notion of Islamic terrorism come from? Does it come from scholars at Cambridge or at the Sorbonne in Paris, or where does it come from? And of course, if you look back at it, you find that it comes from Zionist-affiliated intellectuals. And one of the earliest places it comes from is two conferences run by a certain person called Benjamin Netanyahu in 1979 and 1984 on terrorism. I think the second book, the volume from the second conference, was called Terrorism, How the West Can Win. The first one's held in Jerusalem, the second one's held in DC. And in 1980, there's no mention of Islamic terrorism. In 1984, there's a whole panel on Islamic terrorism, which is the new threat. And of course, what's happening here is there's a move from saying the biggest threat to the West is not the Soviets anymore.
It's the Islamists.
It's the Muslims. No. Let's come back to Islamists, right? It's the Muslims. Muslim terrorism, Islamic terrorism. They don't talk about.
But they do this, isn't it? They would never say there's a Muslim problem. They'll
oh no, they did at the time.
Did they?
Yeah, in that book. I mean, the guy who chaired the session is a guy called Bernard Lewis, right? Famous former British intelligence officer,
yeah.
But out and out Zionist. And some other people around him who were referred to as the Gang of Four, because each one hated Muslims more than the last.
Yeah.
And so that's the origin of that, and that becomes a dominant thing. The idea of some form of political violence which is specifically Muslim. It's because they have these backward ideas. And I studied.
They want a caliphate. They want that Sharia law.
All that stuff. But
they want to rule the world and black flags and all of that.
And they've got beards and all that stuff.
Oh,
right?
yeah,
and so it was very familiar to me because I studied the conflict in the north of Ireland, right? Yeah. So it was like, these Catholics, they have these funny religious practices. They've got the Republican beard, and it's all the same stuff, right? This is the Irish are bad, etc. So they have this stuff, right? And that specific form of Islamic terrorism is completely different to the Red Army faction or the Brigata Rossi in Italy. It's totally different. It's not, And then also, of course, at the same time, roughly the same time, around about the late 70s, as a result partly of the Soviet intervention in Afghanistan and the CIA's support of the Mujahideen there, and also partly as a result of the role of the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt. There you have this idea that there is something specifically Muslim about political opposition. And of course, they're talking about political Islam here, and they invent the word Islamist. Now, previously, there was a word Islamism, but it meant a scholar of Islam. Right, but from 79 onwards, they start to use the term Islamist for the first time, and they inflect the term Islamism into meaning the generalised threat that you get from Muslims. So the Salafists are the same as the Shia, as the Mujahideen in Afghanistan. They're all the same because they're Muslims, right? And it's a racist term, and so this again is pushed by people like Bernard Lewis. And I've done some research on this and the way in which it emerges. And you can see that it's something which comes from the Zionists, but there's also a specific input from French intellectuals who were involved in Afghanistan, in Egypt, and to some extent in Algeria, who pushed this idea as well. And some of them were as it turns out from my research, funded and published by the CIA. So there was a CIA involvement, but the Zionists were leading this. So the terms that we even think about Islam in the world are terms which are tainted by their origins in Zionist political propaganda. Would
it be wrong for Muslims to adopt this type of language?
It seems to me yes. I mean, I know that some people do say that that there's a positive identity in Islamists, but essentially what it means is that all Muslims are the same. And that so it crushes the differences between different sects. And so when you find Daesh or any other organisation fighting with another Muslim organisation, well, how do you analyse that with the term Islamist? You can't. So you need to be specific about this, right?
You know, the term Islamist, is there similar connotations to the term jihadist from your research?
Sure. I mean, of course, the term jihadist in Western discourse means violent Muslim, Islamist, blah, 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 all the same stuff, of course. As every Muslim says, jihad doesn't mean that, etc., etc. And of course, it flattens the whole, it puts the IRGC together with Daesh as being the same. And of course, they're opposed to each other.
Resistance. I know you have certain positions and opinions on the issue of resistance. For the Muslim and for the Palestinian, most of whom are Muslim, jihad al-dafa, defensive jihad, is something that's obligated to us.
Sure.
You have to defend your home, you have to defend your property, you have to defend your family, your women, your children, your neighbours. You don't have a choice. Allah demands you to do that when it's at your doorstep.
Sure.
How long do you think resistance against the Zionist entity is sustainable? We've had 75 years. Is it a sustainable strategy to see the end or the dismantling of the Zionist entity? And I say this because even resistance now has become a term that's becoming increasingly synonymous with support for terrorism. I say that because I sat on the show with Piers Morgan, who tried telling me that if you use the term resistance, that means support for terrorism. I did remind him that you're neither the CPS nor the UK law enforcement agency to determine that resistance equates to terrorism. What's your thoughts on the general Palestinian resistance struggle? Is it a sustainable strategy?
Well, look, resistance to occupation is a right enshrined in international law.
Which law?
International law.
Just for our viewers and listeners, are there any specific laws and statutes that come
under
to mind?
international law and the Geneva Convention, if you're occupied, there's a right to resist.
Are we talking about Protocol 1, the first protocol of the 1949?
Yeah.
Is there any other ones? Was there one in 1982 or 1983?
I don't know.
Okay. But it's enshrined in international law.
It's enshrined in international law.
It's enshrined in Islamic law.
Sure.
It's enshrined in international law.
And actually, the British government believes this, right?
Okay.
I mean, David Cameron the other day was trying to pretend that he didn't know. I said, well, I'm not sure the exact terms. But, the right to resistance is enshrined in international law, as everyone knows who pays any attention to these things. So, if you're occupied, if the Nazis invade Poland or France, it's a right to resist them. And they have no right of defence. And it's exactly the same in the case of Israel. And so that's the first thing. So resistance is a right under international law. People say it's a duty. And under Islamic thinking, it's a duty. But, it's clearly a duty to many groups and causes to resist if you're under occupation. What is the status
Would you fight if you were a Gazan?
Look, I mean, I think people in circumstances make choices which are difficult, and I think I've understood that since I read The Blood of Others, a novel by Simone de Beauvoir, where the French resistance cell discovers an informer, and a young informer, and they have to execute them. I mean, these are difficult choices that everyone makes under circumstances of not of their own choosing of occupation. So, but what I would say about the resistance in terms of strategy, look, the events of October the 7th showed many people, I think, for the first time, or reminded those who'd forgotten, that actually the Zionist entity is fragile. It's not strong, it's fragile, and it can be broken. And what we've seen since then, of course, we've seen the mass atrocities by the Zionists, the bombing and destruction of almost all of Gaza, masses of casualties, but we haven't seen the defeat of the resistance. The Qassam Brigades, which is the military wing of Hamas, as you know, or the Al-Quds Brigades of the Palestinian Islamic Jihad, or indeed any of the other 6 other factions. There's at least 6 other factions.
The other D6, none of them are prescribed under UK law.
The PFLP GC
They are.
is prescribed.
But the PFLP is not.
But the PFLP is not. The DFLP is not.
No.
The National Resistance Brigades, etc. None of them are prescribed. No. The Jenin Brigade is not prescribed. The Lion's Den is not prescribed in the West Bank.
Doesn't mean they won't be in the months or years to come, but they're not prescribed groups, and they were involved in the events of October the 7th.
That's right, they were. And so what we see with that is that Israel has not managed to destroy the resistance in specifically in Gaza, that they remain strong, that they are killing large numbers of Israeli soldiers, which numbers of which are being denied and suppressed by Israel. Qassam Brigade's statement the other day, Abu Ubaidah said that they had destroyed 1,000 Israeli military vehicles. Now, that's probably true. And that's, of course, just the one front, the Gaza front. Right? And, of course, there are many other fronts, which I think people are not always aware about. So, of course, there's the front in the north with Hezbollah, which, of course, has cleared the 5-kilometre range from the border of all IDF personnel, and all settlers have left as well. And Hezbollah have taken a measured approach and not escalated unless there's been specific escalations against them. They've shown that they can destroy, in response to the assassination by Israel of Saleh al-Aruri in Beirut the other day, they destroyed the Israelis' most important air base, which provides air cover for the whole of the Mediterranean and most of West Asia. So there's that front. And, of course, there's the front in Iraq, the Islamic resistance in Iraq. 23 different factions, I think. People don't understand that, which has been attacking American bases in Iraq and, indeed, American bases in Syria, and also, of course, Israeli bases in the occupied Golan. And then, of course, we've got activities in Syria. And let's not forget, we can't forget the Ansar Allah movement in Yemen, who have closed the Red Sea to Zionist traffic, and now to US and UK traffic,
which warranted airstrikes from the US and Britain and Bahrain and the Netherlands and Australia. Yeah. So we know that Western states can and do intervene.
Of course, but the way that they did the intervention shows that they're scared, right? They know that they know perfectly well, not just that Ansar Allah have Iranian provided weapons, but also that they have weapons that they capture from the Saudis, which, of course, most of which would be made
for British or American
in America and Britain. Yeah. So they know perfectly well that, should they wish to, Ansar Allah can sink large numbers of American boats. And
do you think that's the case?
Absolutely. Absolutely. They've got the weaponry to do it. And these are floating targets. And so the Americans think these are there to project US power, but actually, in the modern day with drones and everything, these are simply floating targets.
They're sitting targets, yeah.
Yeah, sitting in the sea, waiting to be hit. And can we imagine the horror of Ansar Allah sinking 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 American boats? Now, that's why the Americans rang them up and said, "Hey guys, we're about to bomb you, so you might want to clear your bases." And that's what they did, and that's why there was 5 casualties only, and nothing of note was destroyed. The Americans say, "Oh, we've destroyed 30% of their capability." No, they haven't. So the resistance, it's called the resistance axis, is very strong. Now, when I say the resistance axis, I'm not just meaning all of these organisations together, a term which I'm giving to them. This is something which they think of themselves as being part of, and which is coordinated. So that in 2021, when there was an attack on Gaza, the actions of the resistance, meaning all of the factions in Gaza, and indeed Hezbollah and some of the Iraqi factions, were coordinated by Hezbollah, all the Palestinian factions, and the IRGC from Iran in an operations room in Beirut. There's daily coordination on that basis. And Aruri, of course, was in those operation rooms to direct the operation. So this is an actual functioning alliance, even if there's not a formal treaties on it, which is actually stretching not just the Zionist entity, but also US imperialism.
People who'll be watching this, especially fellow white non-Muslims that are from your stripes and colours, they'll be like, "This guy sounds like a freaking traitor. He should be tried for treason." Here they are sitting talking about attacking US ships and British ships, and they don't seem that affected by it. What do we say to the good people of Britain and Europe in trying to explain and contextualise what's happening in the region?
Look, I mean, we meaning the British military and the British political establishment are on the wrong side in these issues. And, it's perfectly plain that the vast majority of people in this country support the Palestinians. And that's, ever more so as a result of the mask slipping after October the 7th. I've been banging on about Zionism for a long time. And people look at me and they're like, he's maybe a bit,
That was only a couple of years ago.
Yeah, and he's maybe got a bit into this, and maybe he's exaggerating a little bit, or maybe they're not as bad as he says. Maybe there's some nice Zionists. And then now they see October the 7th and they're like, "Oh my God, you were right." And I've had this experience.
Have you had those phone calls and conversations?
Yeah, and I've spoken to many other people who've also had the same things of them being told by their friends, don't talk about this anymore. And now they're going, you were right. I didn't realise. What are they doing? And you say, look, it's a genocidal ideology. It was genocidal in 1948, and indeed before that, when they started to do the settlements and they started to execute and kill Palestinians, and of course British soldiers, and the blowing up of the King David Hotel. And let's remember, people don't remember this, that the Stern Gang and the Irgun had active cells in the UK. They invented the book bomb. They killed a guy who was the brother of a British military officer by sending him a bomb in a hollowed out copy of Shakespeare's plays. They invented the book bomb, and that was in the 1940s. People understood then. I mean, when I say people, I mean MI5 understood then that this was a hostile foreign terrorist organisation. And then when Mossad penetrated the Joint Intelligence Organisation of British Intelligence in the early 1950s.
It's stuff documented.
Yeah, MI5's records have been declassified, and it's even in the Jewish Chronicle. and MI5 concluded, now we understand that Israel is a hostile foreign state. And of course it is. And even if Israel is an ally of the US and UK, a frenemy as the term has it, they have also, all the way through this period, seen it as their right to subvert the US and the UK. That's why, of course, they stole the nuclear secrets from the US, and Jonathan Pollard went to jail for it, and then he was pardoned, and then his recruiter from Mossad was pardoned by Donald Trump. So there's a whole story here.
Why does Britain and America accept it? Why do they accept these violations? Because off camera, I was telling you about how I'm having interesting conversations with those who would be traditionally pro-Israel. Elements of the far right who would traditionally be against anything brown and Muslim. But a lot of these people are waking up and they're asking the right questions. And one of the things that the main focus seems to be, the crack that's emerging amongst the right, is that why does a foreign country like Israel, a foreign entity like Israel, have such nefarious tentacles of influence in our policy-making decisions? Will that ever change, David?
Well, that crack is certainly something which is there. And of course, at the same time, some of the people on the right are saying, maybe we got the Muslims wrong. And they're not all saying that, as you were saying about some of them, but some of them are saying, maybe we got the Muslims wrong. It was in Istanbul the other day, and and this is a thing I've recognised quite a lot recently. So the Russian journalist was chairing the session I did a talk at, and she gets up and she says, I'm Orthodox, and the Orthodox and the Muslims should be together. And that's now a common sense on parts of the right. Yep. Yes, the Slavic right and the Orthodox Christians, but also on the right in the US, some of the Christians in the US are taking similar sorts of positions, and that's kind of quite interesting and new. So people on the right appearing on pro-Palestine demonstrations, that didn't happen in the 80s, right? It's happening now, and that's really very interesting. But so what we see is the falling away of the ideological supports for Zionism. And of course that means it's weaker and weaker, and it means that whether it can survive is now an open question in a way it wasn't before October the 7th.
What's your thoughts on the position that the Zionist entity will only cease to exist, or only will realistically start dismantling, but it's intrinsically linked to the downfall of the US? Do you think those two things are linked? So the decline of the US as a global superpower, it still is the global superpower, but there's definitely competing forces now in China and Russia and so forth. Do you think the downfall of the Zionist entity is linked to the decline or downfall of the US imperial empire?
Well, of course. I mean, the question you asked before I didn't answer is the question about what's the role and why is it that British imperialism and US imperialism supports Israel? Why is it the Americans appear to give them carte blanche to do whatever they want?
Why can't they just do their imperialism without Zionism? Why can't they do their imperialism without Israel? That's because imperialistic aspirations, for those who can actually do it and those who have aspirations, you can do it without. I can't see what the need of Zionism and Israel is.
So the argument traditionally on the left and other places is that they wanted an attack dog in West Asia, and I think that's
in the heartlands of the Muslim world.
I think that's true. I think that's if you look back at the history of the creation of the Zionist entity, that's what they thought. What was it? Somebody said a little loyal Ulster in the Middle East, right? So settler colony in Ireland, exactly the same, right? So that's part of it. But then, of course, the question is, when you have your attack dog, if it slips the leash, starts to steal your secrets, starts to use your passports to assassinate people. Let's remember that in 2 cases, the Mossad were expelled from the UK. People perhaps forgotten.
How long ago was that?
1986, Thatcher expelled the entire Mossad bureau.
Wow.
Right? Because they were involved in running 2 Palestinian agents from Fatah to kill a Palestinian cartoonist, Najee al-Ali, who did Handler, the famous cartoon.
Yeah, of course.
Assassinated by...
So Thatcher expelling them was linked to this assassination of...
They assassinated this guy, Najee al-Ali, and Thatcher expelled the entire Mossad bureau as a result. Right.
And the other time?
The other time was when the Mossad used stolen British passports to pose in tennis gear and go up on the lift and assassinate that Hamas commander in, I think, Dubai. Mm-hmm. And then I think it was Miliband, of all people, who expelled a Mossad or 2 Mossad officials as a result of that. So it can be done, and clearly there are people in the British foreign policy establishment who still understand that Israel can be a threat. So this is not something of the far past. There's still remnants of that inside the British foreign policy establishment, but doesn't seem to be the dominant strand at this stage. So there we have it. It is possible for Western states to act against other states. And I mean, this does relate to Zionism, but let's take the example of Suez, when the French and the British conspired with the Zionists to invade Egypt over the Suez Canal. And what happened? The Americans said to Britain, no. And Britain was gone like that. And that was the end of the preeminence of Britain in the world.
You're talking about the Suez Canal?
In 1956, yeah. So, Western powers at some point realised that their allies are not their allies, or have ceased being allies, and they need to be disciplined. But at this stage, we're facing the attack dog having slipped the leash, and the question is when and where will the Americans withdraw support? But your bigger question was a question about the relationship between the decline of US power and Zionism. And of course,
are they linked together?
Absolutely crucially linked together. I mean, the reason that we have such a sort of unclear position about this is because of the decline of US power. Look, America and the UK have just been decisively routed in Ukraine. They went in saying, the Russians are disorganised, they haven't got any equipment.
Strong as ever they are.
Soldiers are not loyal, we'll kill them all, Putin will be disposed. No, on the contrary. I mean, Putin has ramped up military production. The UK and the US have depleted all of their arms stocks. They haven't got enough weapons. They can't even replace them, because we're in a neoliberal society where there's no wartime production. So even if they wanted to, it would take years and years for them to rebuild their stocks. So they're in a very, very weak position. At the same time as this is happening, of course, there's the de-dollarization process. Even the Saudis are trading, have gone away from trading in dollars, even the Saudis. And so we have the US economy looking much more weak, and so we have, of course, the US military power declining, and that was what we see with the Operation Protect Prosperity, where they put together this coalition to take on Ansar Allah, and immediately they announced it fell apart. I mean, just fell apart. The US Navy said, we haven't got enough ships. And then France and Germany, so France and Spain and Italy left the coalition.
Yep.
And then all they could do, killed 10 Ansar Allah fighters, but all they could do was attack 3 speedboats. That's all they've done, and then the thing collapsed. And now they've done these bombing raids, the US and UK, where they warn Ansar Allah in advance, just so that they won't escalate too much. So this shows that the US empire is genuinely scared.
So that was flexing. Would you say it was more flexing than anything?
Yeah, that's right.
2 final questions to wrap up the podcast. Both are linked, but have geographic differences in the way we'd apply them. How do you dismantle Zionism outside of the war zone? Here in the UK, here in America, here in the West, where there's more of a civilization and ideological struggle against Zionism. How do we dismantle it here?
So what I would say is, and this is, I suppose, the main point I've been making all these years, is that Zionism is not just something which functions inside occupied Palestine. So, of course, to liberate Palestine, we have to dismantle the institutions of Zionism, which means the institutions of the Zionist state, and replace it with a Palestinian state of all its people. But of course, the Zionists in Palestine can't function, one, without US and UK support, but US support in particular, but two, without the direct support of the Zionist movement in the UK and the US and elsewhere. Now, I've done bits of research on this, and when you look at the details of the organisations involved, it looks like in the UK there's probably about 3,000 Zionist organisations. Right? That's
3,000?
And that's a conservative estimate. Yeah, 3,000. And these organisations are every day dedicated to prolonging and proliferating genocide in Palestine. They're raising money for it. They're inculcating students in genocidal ideology. They're sending money to the IDF. They're sending money to the settlements. All of this stuff, right? There's thousands of these organisations.
Why do I get the feeling that British, Israeli dual nationals, their loyalties are actually with Israel before anything, for many of them? Because it is many of these guys are part of these organisations.
That's right. Well, that's the problem, isn't it? I mean, the problem is not dual loyalty. The problem is primary loyalty to Israel. And that's what Zionists have, almost to a person.
How can that not be seen as seditious or treacherous?
Well, it can be.
But Muslims freaking asking the most basic of questions. We get questioned about deport. No, it's the truth, David. I'm being honest with you.
I know.
You will get away with saying certain things. We were talking about this before filming. You were like, Dilly, you weren't harsh enough in describing X, Y, Z. I said, well, you won't get a knock from Bedfordshire police detectives over a tweet. The point here is we are told third, fourth generation Muslims that we need to get deported for merely questioning foreign policy decisions.
Sure.
Yet you have British Israeli dual nationals who clearly have their interests and their loyalties misplaced or disproportionate, if not entirely, with the Zionist entity.
Sure.
How is that not seditious?
Well, it is seditious, but it's not regarded as being seditious. That's the problem, right?
But why is that conversation not even happening?
Well, it's beginning to happen.
Oh, well,
right?
yeah.
You know, I mean, not enough people are saying it. I'm saying it regularly.
Yeah.
But we have, just yesterday, a dossier provided to the police of British ministers colluding in genocide, and also, I think, 9 specific Israeli British dual citizens who have engaged in genocide in Gaza, right? So that this is beginning to be an issue. These people should be in The Hague, all of them. And I don't just mean the ones who've been in the IDF, but I mean the ones who have been provided the wherewithal for them to be in the IDF. And so that includes, for example, the Union of Jewish Students, which recruits students to the birthright tours. British Jews have no birthright to Palestine, none at all, and it's a racist ideology to say so. They also get recruited through the UGS, a seemingly innocent student organisation, to the Lone Soldier Programme, where people are recruited directly to the IDF and to the ideas and the practice of genocide and killing Palestinians. Now, all of this should stop. What I say is that we dismantle Zionism, not by, as the Zionists keep saying, dismantling individual Jews. They say, it's all about violence and genocide against the Jews. Rubbish. It's about dismantling organisations. So either these organisations cease to exist, we stop those organisations existing, or we can go through a de-Zionisation process. It would be perfectly easy for the Union of Jewish Students to de-Zionize. Take out the 2 clauses.
Mohammed Kurd got in trouble for using de-Zionize.
Well,
not that we give a damn.
That's fine. Take out the 2 clauses in their constitution, which mention being pro-Israel, and disaffiliate from the World Zionist Organization, and that probably by itself would be enough. But that would send a shattering blow through the whole Zionist movement to say that actually we think that Zionism is a racist ideology, we're opposed to racism, and so you have to de-Zionize or your organizations will be shut down. And that's of course what we thought we were doing, or at least it was claimed was being done at the end of the Second World War. We had a denazification program. It's exactly the same. And of course we discovered since then that process didn't really happen with any real force.
Yeah. War zone. The occupied lands, the region itself, they may not have to be dealing with Zionist institutions because they've literally got Zionists in the very institutions and embassies of their respective countries. To say that Egypt, Jordan, even Turkey to a lesser extent, some of the Gulf countries, they don't need to be dealing with these lobby groups per se because they're dealing with it in a much higher level. They've literally got officials, Mossad, undercovers, embedded within their respective states. How does the Muslim world deal with it? How does the neighbouring Arab countries deal with it? I'm not talking about the treacherous and complicit normalisers and rulers, but I'm talking about the people.
Well, they have to reform their leaders. I mean, look, we have, there's I wanted to mention to you an interview which Saleh al-Aruri did with
the assassinated leader of Hamas.
Yeah, with Iranian television in 2017, where he says, look, the people who support the Palestinian resistance is the Islamic Republic of Iran. And people should be clear about that. They are supporting the Palestinian resistance, and they are the main supporters of the Palestinian resistance. And that remains the case today. Right?
What do you say to those Sunnis who haven't forgotten what's happened in Syria, though?
Well,
I say that because that's the discomfort that we have with Iran.
Sure. Okay, so my best, most kind of friendly way of putting this is to say, get over it. Look, I have a completely different understanding of what happened in Syria than you do, right?
Sure.
But the main enemy is not Assad, it's the Zionists. And let's fight about Assad later if you want, right? But we don't need to fight about Assad just now. We need to fight the Zionists. They're the main enemy, and their main support is US imperialism. So let's be clear. We shouldn't have grudging. I'm sorry, I'm speaking as if I'm a Muslim now. There shouldn't be grudging alliances between Sunni and Shia, or between different parts of Shiism and different parts of Sunnism. There should be wholehearted brotherly alliances to get rid of the Zionists. It's the main threat to world peace.
Do you understand the caution, though?
Of course I understand.
Do you understand the caution and distrust?
But we're in a different place. Look, Qassam, all the way through this, they didn't fall out with Iran over Syria. All the way through this. Hamas in Qatar might have done so, but Qassam didn't. So let's look to the Palestinian resistance. They are leading the resistance.
So you have the position, let's not criticize and hate on those who the resistance aren't criticizing and is that what you're basically saying?
I think, look, in any national liberation struggle, there has to be a certain humility before those who are at the sharp end of resistance. That's what I would say.
David, it was an absolute pleasure having you on. I wish you all the best, and I pray to Allah that He makes you successful in your legal case, because if you were to win, it would set a precedent and it would bring a lot of relief to those who have been bullied for years and have had to self-censor, have been victims of bullying, and just had difficult times, whether it's students, teachers. I really, really honestly pray that your case is a successful one, and I know you're under very good legal hands. David, it was a pleasure having you on, brother.
Thank you very much. It was a pleasure for me too.
Brothers and sisters and friends, I hope you all enjoyed this episode as much as I did. There was a lot to go through, and I guess there's a lot more to discuss, and we will have David back on to find out more about his case. Is there anywhere that people can go to find out more about your case? Because they'll Google you and they'll just find all the mainstream coverage. Is there anything specific that you can...
What I would say, what I should have said is that I still have quite a lot of legal fees to cover.
Okay.
And you can find out the details and the background of my case on...
And you can send me the donation link?
On fightingfund.org. That's the link.
We will include the link in the description. I will also pin it on the comments. Brothers and sisters, this is a cause that we should support. It is a type of sadaqah jariyah. It is a type of jihad against the oppressors and the occupiers. Even if the person in question is not a Muslim, he is taking a legal struggle against the occupiers and the oppressors and their proponents and their supporters in this country. So please give generously. Brothers and sisters, if you enjoyed this episode, do remember to click subscribe to the 5 Pillars YouTube channel, leave a comment, like this video, and you can find this episode on all 3 seasons on all the major audio platforms. Until then, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.